Biodiversity is one of these more subtle aspects of diversity that is actually extremely important, but something that we as humans don't often perceive. And that's really about the variation in species diversity from site to site. The worldview of much of ecology is about is sort of how does the environment determine which species live in which places? And that's sort of how I developed in my career, is really thinking about these deterministic parts of community composition. But there's an alternative perspective that's really been emerging lately, is that randomness can play a really strong role on occasion in determining which species live where. And that sort of flies in the face of our want to create this sort of these rules in ecology. That determinism creates which species live where. And so this research is really trying to understand the fulcrum in which stochasticity is going to have a stronger influence on communities, and when the determinism is going to have a stronger influence. And so what I did was I essentially put these ponds out, and I manipulated the environment. I put the same water in the same soil and so on. And in fact, the same species pool, the species are flying overhead and colonizing from other places. And all I did was I varied which species went into the habitats first, just to simulate a little bit of randomness early on in the experiment. The kind of randomness that we often see in natural ecosystems when colonization order can sometimes vary. And then I just let the experiment run. It was a very low maintenance experiment. Every year we would go back and we would count which species were in there, how many there were, species that colonized, went extinct, and so on. And then at the end of the 7 years, I was able to go back and ask how important were those initial differences in those first 2 years in determining what the community looked like over the following several years. Over the last 4 years of the experiment, those higher productivity ponds where we dumped nutrients in were extremely variable. You go from pond to pond to pond, and it's just a completely different group of species, different plants, different dragonflies, different zooplankton, even though they're only 10 meters apart from one another and all arrayed in an old field, just completely different. And they maintain that difference over the last 4 to 5 years of the experiment. The low productivity ponds, you go from one low productivity pond to the next, and it's all the same stuff. And so the low productivity ponds, the history, that sort of initial priority didn't seem to have a large influence. Whereas in those more nutrient-rich ponds, it seemed like history was able to play a stronger role in determining what the final community looked like. If we want to understand how to conserve or maybe even restore biodiversity, it's pretty important to know what creates it in the first place. And in this case, history seems to play an important role in creating some of that variation. And so in the context of restoration, for example, oftentimes we as restoration ecologists introduce certain species in certain orders in order to create the highest local diversity that we can get. But we often forget about this randomness, this historical perspective. And in doing so, restoration ecology might actually be minimizing the influence of history and not necessarily recreating diversity at this larger spatial scale.